Hey everyone, welcome back to Great Northwest Weaponry. This is Thomas, and I've got a really interesting piece to show you guys today. This is a Rast Gasser Model 1898. This is a very strange gun and very hard to come by, actually. I got this from a local store called the Warfront, excuse me. And it was the first ones that they'd ever seen. They got two of them in at the same time. They're supposedly World War II bringbacks, but these were made for the First World War primarily. The gun is dated 1902. This is what the Austro-Hungarian Empire used. It's an 8-shot revolver chambered in 8mm Gasser, and it's a very strange little thing. And ejection is interesting. You got a little swing out on the ejection rod here. It clips onto the bottom and it's stationary when you do that. Roll it over, plunge, click the trigger. When the gate is open, the trigger just rotates the barrel. When the gate is closed, the trigger acts as a double action. So, interesting little piece. Some history behind these. The history is actually a little convoluted. So somewhere around the 1870s, or I believe the year 1870, Leopold Gasser Company, headed by the man Leopold Gasser, created a high caliber black powder cartridge revolver, and it was wildly popular throughout Europe. And sometime in, I believe, the 1880s, the French started using smokeless powder, and Europe as a whole just kind of went crazy trying to get their hands on smokeless powder cartridges and find new guns to use in what they assumed would be an upcoming war, of which did wind up happening, the First World War. And in the year 1897, the Austro-Hungarian Empire began trials for what would be their new service pistol. A man by the name of August Rast designed this, and he brought it to the trials, and it won. They wanted something that had a higher capacity with a smaller, high penetration bullet. So this is, like I said earlier, 8-shot revolver rather than the standard 6. It is an 8mm cartridge, and the shining point of the bullet is that it has more penetrating power versus power. So knockback wasn't something there was concerned about. It was actually a very modern concern. If you look at modern rifles, for the most part, smaller caliber with higher capacity is favored over larger caliber, smaller capacity. So anyway, back to the story. So the gun was adopted, but the government wasn't really aware of wasn't really fond of Rast's company, so they gave the patent to Leopold Gasser. But Gasser would die before production would ever begin. He would pass off the company to one of his two brothers, Johann Gasser, and production would have just kicked off in 1901, and by 1903, Johann Gasser had died, willed the company to what was essentially the general manager of the company, or the foreman, and in lieu of his son being too young to run the company. But the contract had so much legal mumbo-jumbo and so many ifs, ands, or buts that one or two things got crossed, and the company had to dissolve because of legal issues. Because of that, the patent was then given to the company Rast Gasser, headed by August Rast, and the third Gasser brother, I think his name was Michael. If I'm mistaken, I will put a correction underneath this. So all three Gasser brothers were involved in this. This particular model, we'll look closer, but this one is actually a Leopold Gasser patent because of being 1902. It's very uncommon to find one that's got the L. Gasser patent because they only made them in 01, 02, and a little bit of 03. So let's go ahead and put this thing on the table. So taking a closer look at this, and sorry if you guys hear the sound of like flapping wind. We're under a little cover. It's a nasty day in Oregon here today. Looking at some markings on this, as I had mentioned, this gun is dated 02. You can see that right there. And this little mark right before the 02, that they call it the double eagle. It's actually in larger right here. That is the mark of the Austro-Hungarian military. So these guns were officially adopted by the military in 1899, but as I'd already mentioned, production didn't actually begin until 1901. Around 175,000 were produced for the military, maybe a little more. and somewhere around 200,000 overall. There are a couple of different variants based on the year, and when we get into the disassembly, we'll look at where some of those variances come in. One thing, later models, usually the military marking will be up here instead of over here. I had mentioned that this one is the L. Gasser patent. I don't know how well you can see that, but yeah, L. Gasser patent wine, or vine, or vine, or however the heck they say it. I don't speak fluent German, so it's an interesting gun. So let's look at some of the weirder features of this. There is actually a way to get into the trigger assembly very quickly. So what you do, you see there's some texture back here. You grab this, you need to press and pull, and then there's some more textured spot right here. You see there's a hinge on the back of the gun. The whole face of it just opens right up, and there's your whole trigger assembly. It's a very interesting design, a very weird design, kind of very steampunk to me. So closing it back up is just as easy as opening it. Now if you want to extract the cylinder, see this little lug right here, you pull, and then you slide this whole ramrod assembly off. Open up the gate, and the cylinder falls right out. And again, look at that. It's like a flower almost. 8-shot. Interesting design. And while we're on the topic of how many shots it holds, for comparison, this is an 8mm Gasser. This is the round that the gun takes. This is a 9mm. So it's longer and a little bit skinnier. It's a very interesting little bullet, and to my knowledge, the only gun that ever used it was this. So reassembly, just as easy as assembly. Just insert. I'm going to go ahead and close the gate so that doesn't fall out on me. And you just kind of got to hold it in place. Pull on that lug again, and before we actually put the lug back in, this right here, that hole. Later models, they elevated that a little bit to make it a little more sturdy because they found that downward pressure could sometimes knock this piece free on the earlier models. So, yeah. Couple more little facts about this gun before we wrap it up. You will notice the firing pin is actually mounted to the frame on this. That is a design that is still used today, and in World War I revolvers, especially ones that date back to the 1800s, that is actually pretty uncommon. Usually the firing pin would be mounted to the hammer, and it makes for replacing the firing pin considerably easier than if it's actually on the hammer assembly. Then there's more pins and stuff that you got to drive out. It's just a little bit more of a complicated process. So, as I've now mentioned a couple of times, this being the L. Gasser patent rather than the other way around with the Rast Gasser patent, they only made these under L. Gasser until they reached about the 1600 serial number range. This one is right around the 1100. And going back to overall numbers, if you imagine, 200,000 of them were made in total, more or less. I don't know that there's an exact number, and serial numbers are linear on this. But with almost, around 200,000 guns, having less than 1,600 of them being L. Gasser makes this pretty uncommon and very awesome find. I'm very excited about it. One of my goals with my collection is to, at some point in time, get to where I have one pistol and one rifle from each of the major participants of both World Wars, plus whatever other guns I find interesting. Speaking of the World Wars, around 1912, before the wars actually began, this was almost kicked off of the roster of what the Austro-Hungarian military actually used by guns like the Rothsteyr and the Steyr Hahn, and this competed against semi-automatic pistols in the trials in 1897 and 98, but the technology at the time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire just wasn't quite there yet. Guns like the Rothkrinka or Krinka, or however the heck you're supposed to say that. Again, I'm not Austrian nor German, but that gun, it didn't perform as well. And the single loader design of this is an interesting design choice because it actually did compete against some side loaders where you open up the side and the whole cylinder just falls out the side and you can Their reasoning was that they were having some problems with fouling, where it was a 2,000 round test where gunk would just get under the ejector rod and just make it not work as well. So a strange design choice, maybe the only I would say, bad design choice of the whole gun, because as a whole, this thing is highly functional. They were built incredibly well, and with the fact that it came up against semi-automatics before the First World War, and still kind of held its own, but also at the same time, not only did it perform still, well enough to be serviceable, but then the First World War break out, and as you probably are aware, any country that had a major participation in the First World War was fielding any weapon that they still had in their arsenal, because they were mobilizing numbers that they'd never seen before. So let's go ahead and load this guy up again, and again, you just open the gate, and as you pull the trigger, it rotates the cylinder on its own. And one more thing, while we're loading this up, there is some, I would say, misinformation online about these being able to take the 7.62 Nagant round. Now, I don't know about modern Nagant rounds, but I actually, at the store that I bought this at, they happen to have some Milsurp 7.62 Nagant for the Nagant revolver that was original rounds, and they did not fit. And I think it was particularly, like, the first thing that comes up if you look up the Rast Gasser revolver is Wikipedia making the claim that these were chambered for 7.62 Nagant or 8mm Gasser. They do not chamber 7.62 Nagant. Don't buy a box of 7.62 Nagant if you try to get one of these. It will not fit. You will be only disappointed. Just try and find some 8mm Gasser. The only company that I'm aware of that makes it is Fiocchi, which is what we're using today. So let's go ahead and put a last cylinder through this thing and then get it out of the rain. We're going to start with single action. Alright, that's all 8. Thing handles really nice, and it's got a steep grip, but it actually sits pretty true to point of aim. It is a nice gun, and I hadn't mentioned the lanyard ring yet. You probably already had seen it if you're paying attention, but it's there. It has a lanyard ring. Might get a loop for it someday. Don't know. We'll see. So yeah, very interesting piece, very unique piece, and something I'm really glad to have in my collection. And if you stick around for next week, we're going to be taking a look at another modern gun. This time we'll probably be looking at the Tavor X95 that I had mentioned when I did the demo of the Jericho for the first video on the channel. So in the meantime, hope you enjoyed. It's been Thomas with Great Northwest Weaponry, and I'll see you next time.